Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and never taking another step. No walk to the kitchen, no stairs, no sidewalk under your feet, just stillness. It sounds harmless, maybe even relaxing, a break from the grind. But somewhere beneath your skin, a silent alarm is already going off. Inside your bones, a process older than the human species has just been switched into reverse. You won't feel it today. You won't feel it tomorrow. But your skeleton already knows something has changed, because bones are not what most people think they are. They are not rocks. They are not scaffolding. They are not simply there to hold you up. Bones are alive. They breathe in their own strange way. They rebuild themselves constantly, cell by cell, layer by layer. And the moment you stop walking, that rebuilding process starts working against you. This is the story of what happens inside your skeleton when movement disappears. It begins in a place most people never think about. A quiet battlefield hidden inside every bone in your body. Two types of cells live there, locked in an endless negotiation. One is called the osteoclast. Its job is destruction. It dissolves old bone tissue, clearing space, breaking things down. The other is called the osteoblast. Its job is creation. It lays down new bone, filling the gaps, building fresh material. For most of your life, these two forces stay balanced: destruction and creation. Break down and rebuild. This balance has a name. Scientists call it bone remodeling. Every single year, a surprising amount of your skeleton gets replaced. Old bone dissolves. New bone forms in its place. It's like a city that never stops renovating itself, one brick at a time, without ever closing down. Researchers estimate that a healthy adult skeleton replaces somewhere around 10% of its total bone tissue every single year. Which means the skeleton holding you up today isn't quite the same skeleton you had a decade ago. Cell by cell, it has been quietly rebuilt, over and over, without you ever noticing the renovation taking place. And the construction crew inside your bones takes its orders from something you'd never expect. Your movement. Every step you take sends a signal deep into your skeleton. A tiny mechanical vibration, a pulse of pressure, a wave of force. Your bones are listening for that signal. There's a name for this relationship between force and bone. It's called Wolff's Law, named after a 19th century surgeon who noticed something remarkable. Bone doesn't just sit there and take damage. Bone responds to stress. It adapts. Load a bone repeatedly, and it grows denser, stronger, thicker in the exact places it needs to be. Scientists sometimes describe this using a concept called the mechanostat, a kind of internal thermostat, but for mechanical stress instead of temperature. Just as a thermostat senses when a room grows too cold and triggers the heating to switch on, your skeleton senses when mechanical loading drops below a certain threshold and quietly triggers a very different kind of response. Instead of switching on, it switches off. Construction slows. Maintenance fades. Remove that load and the opposite happens. The bone assumes it isn't needed anymore, and it starts giving itself away. This is the hidden cost of stopping, not injury, not disease, simple absence. Your skeleton is built on a rule almost nobody knows. Use it or lose it, quite literally, cell by cell. To understand how fast this can happen, scientists didn't have to guess. They had a perfect laboratory already waiting for them, 250 miles above the Earth. Astronauts. When a person leaves gravity behind, walking becomes meaningless. There is no ground to push against, no weight to carry, and within days their bones begin dissolving from the inside out. Studies on astronauts aboard long space missions have shown bone density losses of around 1 to 1.5% per month, concentrated heavily in the hips and lower spine. That might sound small. It isn't. Stretch that over 6 months in orbit, and some astronauts return to Earth having lost more bone density than an elderly person loses in an entire decade. In space, without gravity's pull, the body treats bone like unused furniture in an empty house. something to be quietly removed. But here's the strange part. You don't need to leave Earth for this to happen to you. Gravity is still pulling on your body right now. But if you stop walking, stop standing, stop loading your skeleton, your bones can't always tell the difference. To your skeleton, stillness on Earth and stillness in space start to look remarkably similar. This is where hospital beds enter the story. For decades, doctors assumed that resting a patient completely was the safest path to recovery. Lie still, heal quietly, let the body repair itself. Instead, researchers began noticing something troubling. Patients on extended bed rest were losing bone density at rates that startled even seasoned physicians. Studies on healthy volunteers placed on strict bed rest for weeks at a time recorded significant losses in the bones of the hip and heel, some of the most heavily weight-bearing bones in the entire body. The immobility itself, not the illness, was doing the damage. Doctors call this disuse osteoporosis. Not aging, not disease, simply disuse. Your body doesn't wait for permission to start dismantling what it thinks you no longer need. Perhaps the clearest evidence of this comes from research on people living with spinal cord injuries. When paralysis affects the legs, those limbs still exist, still have blood flow, still receive nerve signals for many basic functions. But they no longer bear weight. They no longer walk. Studies on individuals with paralysis below the injury site have documented substantial bone density loss in the legs, in some cases exceeding the losses seen in bed rest studies, or even long-duration spaceflight, developing over the months and years following the injury. The bones themselves aren't damaged by the paralysis directly. They're damaged by the absence of the very thing this entire story keeps returning to: load, weight, movement, walking. It is, in the most direct sense possible, living proof of everything researchers have found in astronauts and bed rest patients, playing out permanently in real human lives. So how does a bone actually know you've stopped moving? This is where the story turns almost science fiction. Buried deep inside the hard shell of every bone are cells called osteocytes. They are the most abundant cells in your entire skeleton, and for most of scientific history, nobody understood what they actually did. Now we know. Osteocytes are sensors. They sit inside microscopic chambers within the bone, connected to each other by thousands of thread-like extensions, forming a vast underground communication network. Every time your foot strikes the pavement, every time you climb a set of stairs, fluid inside the bone shifts and flows around these cells. The osteocytes feel it. Every step becomes a signal, a whisper traveling through the network telling the bone, "You are being used, stay strong." Stop walking and that whisper disappears. There's a strange detail buried in the history of this discovery, one most people have never heard. In the 1950s, Japanese researchers Ichi Fukada and Iwao Yasuda made an odd observation while experimenting with dried bone in a laboratory. When they applied mechanical pressure to a piece of bone, it generated a small electrical charge. Bone, it turned out, is piezoelectric, meaning it converts physical stress into electricity, the same basic principle used inside certain microphones and sonar devices. Every footstep you take doesn't just create pressure inside your bones. It generates a tiny electrical signal, rippling outward through that same hidden network of osteocytes. Scientists still debate the exact details of how this electrical signal contributes to bone remodeling, but the discovery reframed something remarkable. Your skeleton isn't only a mechanical structure. In a very real sense, it's an electrical one too, wired by every step you've ever taken. Without mechanical signals, osteocytes begin releasing a protein with an almost sinister name: sclerostin. Sclerostin acts like a brake pedal jammed to the floor. It suppresses the bone-building osteoblasts, the construction crew, and slows new bone formation to a crawl. Meanwhile, the demolition crew, the osteoclasts, keep working exactly as before, Destruction continues, creation stalls, the balance breaks, and your skeleton begins to shrink from the inside, even while looking completely normal on the outside. This is the part almost nobody sees coming. You can lose a significant percentage of your bone strength while looking exactly the same in the mirror. There's no bruise, no swelling, no warning sign visible to the naked eye. This is part of why bone density is measured with specialized imaging rather than a simple glance in a mirror. A technology called dual-energy X-ray absorptiometry, usually shortened to DEXA, allows doctors to measure bone density with a level of precision the naked eye could never achieve. It's often the only way anyone finds out how much strength has quietly disappeared, long after the appearance of the body outside gave no hint at all. Without a scan like this, most people wouldn't know their skeleton had changed until the day it finally failed to hold them up the way it always had before. There's another invisible change happening at the same time, one hidden even deeper than the bone's outer shell. Inside the hollow core of many bones sits marrow, a soft tissue responsible for producing much of your blood supply. Researchers studying disuse have found that as bone-forming activity slows down, fat cells often begin accumulating inside that marrow space, replacing tissue that would otherwise support bone and blood cell production. It's as though the empty space left behind by weakening bone doesn't stay empty for long. Something else moves in to fill it. The damage is invisible until, one day, it isn't. A minor fall that should have caused nothing more than a sore hip instead causes a fracture. A simple step off a curb, one that used to mean nothing, suddenly becomes a life-changing event. Picture an elderly woman living alone, someone who spent years managing gradually less activity after retirement, fewer walks, more time in a favorite armchair by the window. One evening, reaching for a light switch, she loses her balance for less than a second. She reaches out. She catches nothing. And she falls. The fracture that follows isn't just a broken bone. For many elderly patients, a hip fracture becomes the single event that changes everything that comes after it. Hospital stays lost independence, and in a significant number of cases documented across decades of research. A sharply elevated risk of death within the following year, driven largely by complications of reduced mobility rather than the fracture itself. The bone didn't fail because she was old. It failed because, for years, it had quietly been told it wasn't needed anymore. This is why disuse osteoporosis is sometimes called a silent disease. It doesn't announce itself. It waits, but not all bones are affected equally. And this is where the story gets even more interesting. Your skeleton doesn't treat every bone the same way. Weight-bearing bones, the ones responsible for carrying your body against gravity, are the most sensitive to inactivity. Your femur, the long bone in your thigh, your tibia in your lower leg, your hip, your lumbar spine, your heel. These bones evolved for one purpose above all others: supporting a walking, moving human being. Take walking away, and these are the bones that suffer first and suffer hardest. Meanwhile, bones that never carried much load to begin with, like the small bones in your skull or the delicate bones of your inner ear, remain largely unaffected. Your skeleton, in other words, punishes exactly the parts of you that stopped working. It's almost poetic, brutally efficient, ruthlessly logical. The body doesn't waste resources maintaining strength where strength isn't being demanded. Consider, for a moment, how differently this plays out across the animal kingdom. A bird's bones are famously light, hollow in places, built for a life spent mostly in flight rather than walking against gravity. A whale's skeleton is dense and heavy, shaped by an entirely different kind of load, the resistance of water rather than the pull of solid ground. Every skeleton on Earth is a physical record of the forces that shaped it, and that record isn't fixed at birth. It keeps being rewritten, every single day, by the forces an animal continues to experience. Human bones are no exception. Yours were shaped by millions of years of ancestors walking upright, running from danger, carrying loads, climbing, pushing, pulling. Take away the walking, and you're not just resting a modern convenience. You're withdrawing the very forces that built the human skeleton in the first place. Now here's a question that might be sitting in your mind right now. How fast does this actually start? Not months, not weeks. Researchers studying bed rest and immobilization have found measurable changes in bone turnover markers within days of reduced activity. Within the first week, the chemical signature of bone breakdown already begins shifting in blood tests, long before any bone scan would show visible loss. By the end of the first month, in cases of severe immobilization, hip bone density can decline by more than 1%, concentrated almost entirely in the areas that once bore your weight. You've likely seen a smaller, more relatable version of this yourself. Think of anyone who's ever broken an arm and spent 6 weeks in a cast. Pull that cast off, and the limb underneath looks noticeably thinner, weaker, almost unfamiliar compared to the other arm. That's the same mechanism at work, compressed into a smaller, more visible example. Remove movement and load from a single limb, and the body starts withdrawing resources from it almost immediately, both in muscle and in bone. The only difference with whole body inactivity is scale. Instead of one limb quietly shrinking inside a cast, it's your hips, your spine, and your legs, all withdrawing at once, with no cast to make the change visible. By 6 months of severe inactivity, some studies on prolonged bed rest patients have documented losses reaching into the double digits in the hip region. To put that in perspective, some elderly patients accumulate that same level of bone loss over 10 to 20 years of natural aging. Inactivity can compress decades of decline into months, and it doesn't stop with the bones themselves. Something else happens at the same time, something most people never connect to bone health at all. Your muscles. Walking isn't just weight bearing down on your skeleton. It's also muscles pulling against bone with every single stride. Every contraction of your calf, your quadriceps, your glutes, tugs on the bone it's attached to, creating additional mechanical stress that keeps that bone strong. Stop walking, and your muscles begin atrophying almost immediately, sometimes losing measurable strength within the first week of inactivity. Weaker muscles mean weaker pulling forces on bone. Less pulling force means fewer signals reaching those osteocyte networks buried deep inside your skeleton. It becomes a feedback loop. Muscle loss accelerates bone loss. Bone loss makes movement harder. Harder movement leads to even less muscle use. Round and round it goes, a downward spiral that becomes progressively difficult to escape the longer it continues. This is one of the reasons elderly patients who become bedridden after a hospital stay often struggle to recover their former mobility, even after the original illness is completely gone. The muscles have weakened, the bones have thinned. And climbing back out of that hole takes far longer than falling into it ever did. Physical therapists who work with elderly patients after hospitalization see this pattern constantly. A patient admitted for something entirely unrelated to their bones, a chest infection, a minor surgery, a short illness, spends a week or two resting in bed. By the time they're medically cleared to go home, the illness that brought them in has resolved. But now there's a second problem waiting, one that had nothing to do with the original diagnosis. Legs that feel unsteady, a grip that feels weaker, a short walk to the bathroom that suddenly feels like a much longer journey than it used to. None of that was caused by their illness. It was caused by the stillness surrounding their recovery from it. This is why many modern hospitals have shifted their approach entirely, encouraging patients to sit up, stand, and walk as early as safely possible after surgery or illness, rather than defaulting to prolonged bed rest the way medicine once did. The old assumption that stillness equals healing has been quietly replaced by a newer, more accurate one. Sometimes the most dangerous part of being sick isn't the illness itself. It's the stillness that comes with it. But the story doesn't end with muscle and bone. There's a chemical consequence too, one connected to something else entirely. Calcium. Your bones store the vast majority of your body's calcium. More than 99% of it lives inside your skeleton. When bone breaks down faster than it rebuilds, that calcium doesn't just vanish. It gets released into your bloodstream. During extended immobilization, researchers have documented measurable rises in blood and urine calcium levels, sometimes significant enough to increase the risk of kidney stones. Astronauts on long space missions have shown elevated risk of kidney stone formation during and after flight, a consequence directly tied to accelerated bone breakdown in microgravity. Your skeleton, in other words, doesn't just quietly shrink when you stop moving. It floods your body with the very minerals it once used to keep you strong, and those minerals have to go somewhere. Sometimes that somewhere is your kidneys. A process that begins with something as simple as sitting still for too long can end with a person doubled over in pain from a kidney stone, with almost no obvious connection between the two events in the patient's mind. The body is a chain. Pull one link and the whole chain moves. But calcium isn't the only thing hiding inside your bones. There's another secret buried in there, one that scientists only uncovered in the last 2 decades. For most of medical history, bone was seen as a structural material and nothing more. A frame, a support beam, useful but silent. Then researchers discovered something that rewrote the textbooks. Bone talks back. Deep inside your skeleton, osteoblasts release a hormone called osteocalcin directly into your bloodstream. This hormone travels far beyond the skeleton, with research linking it to how the pancreas manages insulin and blood sugar, and even, in animal studies, to memory and mood. Your skeleton, in other words, isn't just a passenger being carried around by the rest of your body. It behaves like an endocrine organ, quietly participating in conversations with your brain, your pancreas, and your metabolism, which means when inactivity slows bone formation, it isn't only your hips and spine that lose something. The entire chemical messaging system your skeleton contributes to the rest of your body grows quieter too. A body that stops walking doesn't just lose strength in its frame, it loses a voice inside its own internal conversation. Now, if all of this sounds alarming, here's something important to understand. This isn't only a story about astronauts or hospital patients or extreme cases of total immobility. It's a story about millions of ordinary people living ordinary lives. For nearly all of human history, walking wasn't a choice. It was survival. Early humans walked to find water, walked to hunt, walked to escape predators, walked to migrate across entire continents on foot, generation after generation. There was no version of daily life that didn't involve enormous amounts of movement. Then, in the span of just a couple of centuries, an evolutionary blink of an eye, everything changed. The chair became a fixture of daily life. The elevator replaced the staircase. The car replaced the long walk to market. The remote control replaced even the short walk across a room. Every one of these inventions was designed to remove effort from human life. And each one, quietly, removed a small piece of the mechanical signal your skeleton had relied on for millions of years. None of this makes modern conveniences villains. Nobody is suggesting you give up chairs or elevators or cars, but it helps explain something that once seemed mysterious. Why bone-related conditions like osteoporosis have become so much more common in modern, industrialized populations compared to societies where daily life still demands far more walking and physical labor. The skeleton hasn't changed much in the last few thousand years. The world around it has changed almost completely. Modern life has quietly engineered a version of stillness that most people don't even notice. Long commutes sitting in a car, 8 hours sitting at a desk, evenings sitting in front of a screen. None of this looks like the dramatic stillness of a hospital bed or a spacecraft. But to your bones, chronic low-level inactivity sends a familiar message. You are not being used as much as you once were. Researchers studying sedentary behavior have found associations between prolonged daily sitting and reduced bone mineral density, particularly in populations who get little additional weight-bearing activity elsewhere in their day. It isn't as dramatic as 6 months in a hospital bed, but it accumulates. Year after year, decade after decade, a life spent mostly sitting can quietly chip away at skeletal strength long before old age ever enters the picture. And this is where a myth needs to be gently corrected. Most people assume bone loss is simply something that happens because of aging, an unavoidable consequence of getting older. Age plays a role, certainly. Hormonal shifts, especially the drop in estrogen after menopause, do accelerate bone loss in ways connected to biology rather than behavior. But research consistently shows that physical inactivity acts as an independent, additional driver of bone loss, separate from age itself. In other words, some of what we've been calling getting old is really just the accumulated cost of decades spent walking less than our bodies were designed for. It's a subtle but important distinction. Aging is something nobody can stop, but the added weight that inactivity piles on top of aging is something almost anyone can influence at almost any stage of life. Researchers studying older adults who begin structured walking programs later in life, even well into their 60s, 70s, and beyond, have found improvements in measures related to bone health and fall risk compared to those who remain sedentary. It is never quite as simple as too late. The skeleton keeps listening for footsteps at every age, not only in youth. This reframes everything. Bone loss isn't only a clock ticking forward. It's a door that inactivity keeps propping open, faster than it would otherwise swing shut. There's a concept researchers sometimes use to describe this, one worth sitting with for a moment. Think of your skeleton like a bank account. During childhood and adolescence, active kids running, jumping, climbing, and playing are making enormous deposits into that account, building what scientists call peak bone mass. Most people reach their maximum bone density sometime in their 20s or early 30s. After that, the account slowly shifts from deposits to gradual withdrawals, a natural part of aging that happens to everyone. The size of the account you built in your youth becomes the buffer you're drawing from for the rest of your life. A person who spent childhood active, outdoors, constantly loading their skeleton, often enters older age with a much larger reserve to draw from. A person who spent those same years sitting still starts the withdrawal phase of life with far less saved. And every period of adult inactivity, whether it's a desk job, an injury, or a hospital stay, accelerates the withdrawals further. This is why the walking you do today isn't only about today. It's a deposit into an account you'll be relying on decades from now, at an age when a single fall can change the entire trajectory of a life. Which raises the question every viewer has probably been waiting for. Can this be reversed? Here's the encouraging part of the story, and it's backed by real evidence. Bone tissue that has weakened from disuse can often rebuild itself once mechanical loading resumes. Studies on former bed rest patients and even astronauts returning from long-duration space missions show measurable bone density recovery once normal weight-bearing activity resumes. But there's an important asymmetry researchers keep noticing. Bone loss tends to happen faster than bone gain. You can lose meaningful density in a matter of weeks. Rebuilding that same density back can take months, sometimes considerably longer. Some studies following astronauts after long-duration missions have found that certain areas of hip bone density had still not fully returned to pre-flight levels even a full year after landing back on Earth, despite months of dedicated rehabilitation. Months spent in orbit. Years, in some cases, spent trying to earn that density back. It's an unfair trade, easy to lose, hard to earn back, which is exactly why prevention matters so much more than most people realize. This is something space agencies learned the hard way. Early space missions saw such dramatic bone and muscle loss that engineers had to design entirely new machines just to keep astronauts intact. Today, astronauts aboard the International Space Station spend roughly 2 hours a day on specialized equipment, including a treadmill they must strap themselves to with a harness. Since there's no gravity to hold them against the belt, and a resistance device designed to simulate the pull of weightlifting in an environment where nothing actually weighs anything. Without these machines, the bone and muscle loss experienced on long missions would be even more severe than what's already documented. In other words, humanity spent billions of dollars and years of engineering, essentially trying to recreate the effect of walking, in an environment where walking no longer exists. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the exact thing those machines are simulating is available to almost everyone, for free, the moment they step outside their front door. And here's the part that might genuinely surprise you. The activity required to keep this entire system functioning isn't extreme. It isn't marathon training. It isn't hours in a gym. It isn't anything close to what most people imagine when they picture exercise. It's walking. Simple, ordinary, unremarkable walking. Because walking checks every box your skeleton needs. It applies repeated mechanical load to your weight-bearing bones. It activates the muscles that pull against those bones. It sends a steady stream of vibration through the fluid inside your osteocyte network. Research on postmenopausal women, a population especially vulnerable to bone loss, has shown that regular walking programs are associated with improved or maintained bone density in the hip, compared to sedentary control groups. Other studies point toward an added benefit from activities that involve slightly more impact than walking alone, like light jogging, stair climbing, or brief bursts of jumping, which create even stronger mechanical signals for bone-building cells to respond to. There's an added bonus to outdoor walking, one worth mentioning briefly. Sunlight on skin triggers your body's own production of vitamin D, a nutrient essential for absorbing the calcium your bones depend on in the first place. A walk outside, then, isn't just delivering a mechanical signal to your skeleton. In many cases, it's also helping supply one of the raw materials that signal depends on. Movement and material arriving together from the same simple act. But even without adding intensity, the simple, humble act of walking regularly appears to be enough to keep the demolition crew and the construction crew inside your bones working in balance. Your skeleton isn't asking for heroics. It's asking for consistency. A daily walk, stairs instead of an elevator, standing instead of sitting. Small, repeated signals sent to a network of cells that have been listening for footsteps since before you could remember taking your first one. Think about that phrase for a moment. Your first steps. As an infant, your bones were softer, more flexible, still forming their final shape. And what triggered them to harden, strengthen, and develop their adult structure? Movement. Crawling, standing, falling down, standing again, walking. The mechanical stress of learning to move literally shaped the skeleton you have today. Your bones were built by walking, and in a strange, quiet way, they continue to depend on it for the rest of your life. Stop walking and you're not just resting. You're sending a signal backward, undoing a process that began before you could even talk. There's something almost humbling about that idea. We tend to think of bones as the most solid, unchanging part of ourselves. The skeleton in the corner of every biology classroom, gray, still, permanent. But your actual living skeleton is nothing like that model. It is dynamic, responsive, listening every single day to the way you move through the world. It rewards you when you walk. It quietly withdraws when you don't. And it does all of this without asking permission, without sending a warning, without making a sound. Somewhere right now, in a hospital bed, an elderly patient recovering from surgery is losing bone density faster than they realize, simply from days of stillness that felt, at the time, like rest. Somewhere right now, an astronaut orbiting the Earth is fighting the same invisible battle, using resistance bands and treadmills strapped down by bungee cords, desperately trying to convince gravity-starved bones that they're still needed. Somewhere right now, a person recovering from a broken arm is watching their own limb grow visibly thinner inside a cast, a small preview of a process usually hidden from view everywhere else in the body. And somewhere right now, someone reading these very words is sitting exactly where they've been sitting for the past several hours, completely unaware that a quiet negotiation is happening inside their own hips and spine. Destruction, creation. Which one is winning right now in your body at this exact moment? The answer depends entirely on something so simple it almost feels like it can't be true. Whether or not you get up and walk, not for an hour, not for a marathon, just enough to remind an ancient, listening network of cells that you're still here, still using what they once built for you. There is no dramatic finish line to this story. No single walk that fixes everything. No single missed walk that ruins everything either. It's quieter than that. Slower than that. It's a conversation repeated every single day, one your skeleton has been having with gravity since before you could speak, before you could crawl, before you had any say in the matter at all. And the remarkable thing is, you still have a say in it now. Because in the end, this isn't really a story about astronauts, or hospital beds, or elderly patients. It's a story about a conversation your body has been having with gravity since the very first day you stood upright. Every step is a message. I am still here. I am still using this. Keep it strong. Stop sending that message and your skeleton, patient and obedient, will believe you. It will start giving back what you no longer seem to need. So imagine again that same morning you pictured at the beginning. No walk to the kitchen. No stairs. No sidewalk beneath your feet. Except this time, imagine choosing differently. Imagine standing up anyway. Imagine feeling your foot meet the floor, sending that same ancient signal traveling upward through your leg, into your hip, into the quiet, listening network buried deep inside your bones. A signal that has been rebuilding skeletons since the first humans ever stood on two legs. Your bones are not asking you to run a marathon. They are simply asking you not to disappear on them, because the ground has always been waiting. And your bones have never stopped listening for the sound of your next step.